Welcome back to Anatomy Physiology. This is part 2 of chapter 16, and we're talking about the nerves that make up your special senses. We've been talking about taste, bitter, sour, umami, sweet, and salty. And we talked a little bit about peppers. The really hot peppers don't travel through the taste buds. The hot peppers actually stimulate your pain receptors, your nociceptors, and not your taste buds. And the information travels in your trigeminal nerve. When I was working on my doctorate, I worked at a Mexican restaurant, and I'd always have customers who come in wanting really hot peppers. And they'd sit and eat them, and they would sweat and sweat. And then they usually ran for the bathroom, too. So we found that the chemicals that are in the hot peppers actually have some beneficial effects. So if you have arthritis, you can rub the capsaicin from the hot peppers onto your skin, and it should keep the pain receptors confused. Actually, it brings blood into the area, and that causes your joints to warm up around the arthritic area and relieves the pain. And now we're going to talk about olfaction, or smelling. Olfactory senses. Chemicals that you can smell are considered to be odorants. And one of the things that kind of takes you aback and makes you think for a minute going, oh, is the things that you smell have to dissolve in the mucus in your nose. So when you're smelling Cinnabons, oh, that nice smell is actually part of some Cinnabon that's come into your nose and dissolved into your mucus. And when you go in the bathroom and you go, whoa, somebody's been in here and been really gross, you're getting a little bit of that dissolved in your mucus also. The front part of your nose has two nares with a septum separating the two. And as you go past that, you get into the concha and the meatuses. Little kids adore sticking things up their nose, beans, raisins, rocks, and they get stuck in those folds in the nose. Here's an autopsy picture where they've cut away the bone. So here's where you put your finger in. Here's the septum. And then there are the concha and the meatus right there. And that's where little kids get rocks and things stuck up in their nose. And if you remember when we did the skull, we saw little bitty openings called the cribriform plate. And I said that this is where the nerve endings hang down in there so that it can sample what you're smelling and send that information on to the brain. It's always interesting to look at the artist's representation of what these look like versus what they really look like when you use an electron microscope. It's kind of neat. The olfactory cells are actually neurons, and they say they're shaped like bowling pins. And they have 10 to 20 little cilia called olfactory hairs. And they're not modal. So when we looked at the trachea, we saw that the cilia there are moving the mucus around. But these have mucus right there, but they're not modal. They're not wiggling around. They just lay there. If you put the axons of all of these olfactory cells together, then they're collectively called the olfactory nerve, which is the cranial nerve 1. So you remember when we were looking in lab at pictures of the cranial nerves, they never show you a picture of cranial nerve 1. And now you know why. So remember that the little holes are called foramina. If it's a big hole, it's a foramen. And these are little tiny ones. There's a lot of them in the cribriform plate. Here's another picture putting it all together. So there's the mucus in your nose, and there are the neuron right there. And here are the holes, or the foramina, in the cribriform plate. And up here is the olfactory bulb. Olfactory cells are the only neurons in the body that are exposed directly to the external environment. So they're just kind of hanging out there, literally, with their ends bared in the mucus. So they don't have a long lifespan, but luckily we can replace them. So we regrow them. So it makes me wonder, in this time of COVID, when people lose their sense of smell, it should come back within 2 months, because you're going to grow new neurons and they won't have been exposed to COVID, so there isn't any reason for you not to be able to smell anymore. Also, it'd be interesting if you could take those neurons and put them in another part of the body where you have neurons that don't divide, like in someone who has Alzheimer's, and see if they start taking their cues from nearby neurons, and instead of acting like an olfactory neuron, start acting like a neuron that's necessary for our thought processes. I've never heard anybody doing any research that way, but it seems like that would be a smart thing to do. Remember that all cells have all of the information they need to be any cell that they want to be, but they have chemical cues that turn off certain of the genes so that they don't express those genes. But if you take, for example, one of the things they like to do with fruit flies is take some of the pieces of the fruit fly as it's developing and put them in strange places. So they've taken the cells that have committed to being the leg and stuck it in the eye, and so the fruit fly will grow a leg out of its eye. So it makes sense that an olfactory neuron might be able to be tricked into thinking that it is a memory neuron. I disagree with this statement right here. It says humans do not have a poorer sense of smell than other mammals. I don't think that the person who wrote that actually owns dogs, because dogs have an amazing sense of smell. Each olfactory cell has receptors for only one chemical compound, which they're going to call an odorant. So each of the smells that you get, that you perceive, are due to a combination of different olfactory cells. I always like trivia, so here's one of the little bits of trivia. Women are more sensitive to smells than men, and especially during the time of ovulation. One of the things I always tell my lab students when we're doing this particular lab is, when you go buy cologne, or when you go buy aftershave or perfume, whatever, take your significant other with you, your husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, whoever, and let them smell whatever it is that you're going to buy on you, because we don't all perceive smells the same. So you may find some perfume that you absolutely love and you take it home, and the person you want to impress with it goes, "Whoa, it smells like dog urine." The magazine National Geographic came up with an issue many, many years ago when my children were young, and we all sat around and had scratch and sniff pages. And so we'd scratch it and then pass it around, and all of us would rule on it, like, "Ooh, that smells wonderful, like vanilla," or "Whoa, that is so stinky." And it was fascinating to see what one person thought smelled good and what one person thought smelled bad. Now, oddly enough, when I drive by a dead skunk, which is pretty often because I live in the state of Kentucky, I smell lemon. I know most people, when they smell a skunk, they start screaming and yelling, "Oh, it's horrible, it's awful." And I'm like, well, it actually smells kind of citrusy to me. Hopefully you remember from other chapters how sometimes a receptor will take on something. In this case, it's an odorant, something that has a smell. And instead of bringing it inside the cell, it leaves it out in the receptor, but by coupling to the receptor, it triggers a cascade effect. And so inside the cell, you're going to make cyclic A&P, you're going to open some sodium channels or some calcium channels, you can depolarize the membrane. So you get an action potential that travels to the brain. But the odorant that got out there on the receptor and bound to the receptor is not brought into the cell. So that's the second messenger system, if you remember that. And some of the things that really stink actually hit the pain receptors of the trigeminal nerve. So the capsaicin I was talking about before in hot peppers. But back a long time ago, women would wear really, really tight corsets, and they actually had trouble breathing, that they were laced so tightly, and so they were always fainting. And so they carried a little vial of ammonia in their reticule. Remember, the reticule is the little beaded purse that kind of looks like fishnet stockings. And when you smell the ammonia, the pain of it actually would bring you out of your faint. So they would wave ammonia under your nose to wake you up from a faint. I hesitate to point this out to you for fear of confusing you, but we looked at this picture and we saw these neurons going through the cribriform plate and up to the olfactory bulb. I didn't point out these little clusters of olfactories because they call them a glomerulus. And 99.9% of the time when you say the word glomerulus, they're talking about the filtering unit in the kidney. So this is really confusing to have something that is in the olfactory bulb also being called the glomerulus. The only thing off of this slide that I expect you to know is that you have olfactory fibers that are specific for one smell, one chemical odorant, as they call it. And your higher brain gets all of these different odorants, all of the different information from the odor-specific glomeruli, and says, this is a dark chocolate. Or, oh, this wine has overtones. For example, cloves, cinnamon, vanilla, caramel. Some of these are added as you're making the wine. In Kentucky, we know how important the barrels are that you make the different whiskeys. So some of the oils and flavorings from the barrel actually come into the liquor. It makes sense that the part of the brain that would analyze the different smells that you have would be around the temporal lobe. Because think where your temples are in relation to your nose, not so far away. This has way more information than we actually need, but I wanted to point out a few things. So not only does it go to the temporal region of your brain, but it goes into the hippocampus, the insula, the hypothalamus, and it relates the smell to your olfactory memory, and it can produce an emotional response or a visceral response. So sometimes people smell an apple pie and they go, oh, this reminds me of my mom. My mom used to make apple pie, and they'll actually start crying. And then other times you smell something. For example, when I smell vinegar, it makes my stomach churn because I've eaten things that had vinegar in them that made me throw up. And so I'm just ready when I smell vinegar to think, oh, okay, if I eat whatever this is, it's going to make me toss my cookies. Another interesting thing is if you're hungry, things will smell a lot better than if you're full. Satiety means you're satiated or you're full. So even though you're smelling that pie that just came out of the oven and normally you would be all over it, you just finished a huge Thanksgiving dinner or whatever, and you're so full that even that wonderful, wonderful smell doesn't smell good to you right now because you're too full. And now we're going to talk about hearing and equilibrium. And they put the two together because the part of the brain, the part of the ear that sends the messages to the brain also sends information about whether you're standing up, laying back, leaning over, things like that. When we talk about light, we talk about the visible spectrum of electromagnetic energy that comes into the eyes. And it doesn't need anything to propagate. It doesn't need anything to pass through. It just can come through from outer space, from our sun, from the stars, and enter the little hole, the pupil of your eye, and hit the retina in the back and cause the brain to say, ah, I see light. But the ear requires actual physical air hitting against it to cause the tympanic membrane, which you and I call the eardrum, to vibrate. So there is no sound in a vacuum because there are no air molecules to hit your eardrum, to hit your tympanic membrane. Also, when you make sounds like you're singing or yelling or whatever, you're wiggling your vocal cords, and this is going to cause the air to be stopped or started or propelled faster or slower. And the longer vocal cords are, then the deeper your voice is, which is why guys have such a large Adam's apple. It allows them to have deeper voice, deeper sounds. I've been teaching this for many, many years, and I remember when one of my students came and said, I was telling my other teacher what you were talking about on how we hear, and she said, man, she doesn't know what she's talking about. So the student and I looked it up, and lo and behold, I do know what I'm talking about. We have tiny rocks in our ears called otoliths, and they cause these little hairs to bend, and it lets you know whether or not your head is down or over to the side, depending on how the rocks are causing the hairs to bend. I've put a YouTube link at the top of this slide, and it's really fun to do. This sound test makes different frequencies. And since I'm older, I can't hear any of these frequencies all the way until you get right here where it says, sorry, could you speak into my good ear? But most of my students, being much younger, can hear over in the fantastic or the wow, definitely in the normal range. So students take advantage of this by setting their ringtones over in this range where they know that the teacher can't hear it. Here's a simple summary. Any audible vibration of molecules, a tuning fork, someone screaming, somebody setting off a firecracker, they will push air molecules, and the air molecules will hit your eardrum, also known as tympanic membrane, causing it to vibrate. Pitch is how we determine in our own mind whether a sound is high or low. It's actually not a thing. It's more of an impression. It's how you feel about something. So you say, wow, that person has a really high-pitched voice. Or wow, how low and deep is that person's voice? Luckily, even though we lose so much of our frequency range as we get older, the range where we can hear people talking remains. So that's good. So I can still hear people, even if I don't hear a lot of those really high-pitched noises. We call the frequency of vibration hertz. That's the units of hertz, H-E-R-T-Z, kind of like, the cars, you run hertz. Here is decibels. So loudness is measured in decibels, and you can actually measure this one with a machine and say, yes, this is 20 decibels, and I can't hear it. Or this is 60 decibels, that's about right for just speaking correctly. Up here, you're yelling, you're shouting. Most of us like our music a little louder than we like just hearing somebody speaking. And if you go over 120, you're actually feeling physical pain. My students are always bringing me interesting facts and interesting YouTubes, and one of the ones that they brought me was somebody figured out that if you can figure out the frequency of something's vibration, we all have a natural frequency, then you can cause that to shatter. So there are people who can sing and they can hit a note that is the same frequency that a glass or piece of crystal will resonate, and they can cause the glass to break. So in order to weaponize it, apparently our military have found the resonant frequency for human beings. And if you get close to it, it causes the people to vomit. So if you have one of these sound generating machines and you want to break up a gathering that you don't want to be gathered, then you can bring in one of these, and the sound waves will actually cause the people to start throwing up, and so they'll run away from the area to get away from the sound waves. A couple of other interesting examples come to mind. They found that if you go across a bridge and everybody's marching, that you'll set the bridge to swaying, and it's a possible outcome that you could break the bridge. And in California, they had some really high winds, and they just happened to be at the right frequency to get the roadways to swaying back and forth, and it ended up with the roads breaking.
The bridge suddenly went into a twisting motion. The wind speed was a steady 42 miles per hour. This was enough to keep the bridge oscillating in one of its natural modes of vibration with a
Any prolonged exposure to sound can cause damage to your ear that's permanent. So every time I see students walking around with headphones on or earbuds on, and I can hear the music down the hall, I know that what's going into their ears is way too much. When I was growing up, we had acoustical guitars and we had microphones. So we didn't get huge blasts of sound. But now they have rock and roll amplifiers that will absolutely blow your eardrums out. And some of the musicians got together, really famous musicians, and talked about how they have hearing loss because they're up on stage and they're hearing all of the instruments all around them, plus the big amplifiers are up on stage blasting past their ears and out into the audience. So a lot of them have lost their hearing. The outer ear and the middle ear are separated by the tympanic membrane, which is the eardrum. And then the inner ear is where you actually take the vibrations that you pick up in the outer and the middle area and convert it to nerve signals that your brain translates for you. If you're going to be an audiologist, you'll need to know each and every one of these parts: the helix of your ear, the lobule, which is your earlobe. But I want you to know that you have the external auditory meatus, also known as the external acoustic meatus, which is just this hole right there, and that this whole outer piece is called the auricle or the pinna. You should also know that earwax is called cerumen, and it is a mixture of oils and dead skin cells. And unfortunately, some people make a lot of earwax, and it builds up in this external auditory meatus or external acoustic meatus, and it actually keeps the tympanic membrane from vibrating. So they have to go in and remove it. And if you really, really want to gross yourself out, just go on YouTube and look for cleaning earwax out of ears. It can actually cause you to throw up to see what they pull out of people's ears. Behind the eardrum, you have the middle ear, and it should be air-filled, not fluid-filled. If it's fluid-filled, then you've got some sort of an infection going on. So one of the kinds of infections you can get is swimmer's ear, where you have a fungus growing in that area. And of course, little kids are always getting ear infections. And because the tympanic membrane is transparent, looking into the ear, the doctor or the PA or whoever can actually see the infection behind the eardrum. They can see the fluid and they can see the pus. And sometimes, unfortunately, you actually see the eardrum bulging from the pressure where the fluid is trying to get out of the ear. So it can't go back down the eustachian tube because the eustachian tube is infected. So what it'll eventually end up doing is it'll actually rupture the eardrum. It'll tear it. And unfortunately, once you've torn your eardrum and you replace it with scar tissue, you're never going to have it vibrate correctly. I kind of use the analogy of when you're playing the drums and you stick your drumstick through the head. You can put a piece of tape on it and continue playing your drum, but it's never going to sound just right. Luckily, your tympanic membrane, your eardrum, can feel pain. So if you're feeling pain in your ear, you know that you're causing damage in your inner ear. So you need to cut the volume down. You need to put on protective ear guards, plugs, noise-canceling headphones. And you also have 3 little bones, which are the smallest bones in your body, called the ossicles. I put this 20-second video in my YouTube channel because I think it's fascinating. They're looking through the eardrum and they're seeing the movement of the bones inside the ear. And there's the eardrum actually vibrating. Here's what we were looking at. So here's the external auditory meatus right there that you can put a cotton swab in and get some of the cerumen or earwax out. There's the tympanic membrane, and these are the bones that we saw vibrating. So I'm assuming that they got the camera up through the eustachian tube in order to be able to look out like that and see the sunlight coming in. When you were a child, you learned the names of the bone as hammer, anvil, and stirrup. But now that we're in anatomy class, the hammer is known as the malleus, and it touches the eardrum, the tympanic membrane. And then the anvil, and the stirrup actually looks like the stirrup where you would step up onto a horse. So that's fascinating. So this is all mechanical. This is air molecules coming in and hitting and causing this to vibrate, which causes this to vibrate, and we're still sending the message as a mechanical movement of air and bone. Before we leave this picture, I want to show you this is the eustachian tube, and normally any fluid that would get up in here would just drain out. But if this is swollen shut for any reason, then that's when you can get an infection in behind your eardrum. So it's always been called the eustachian tube, but they're trying to rename it the auditory tube. So you're probably going to see it both ways. Here's some more important things to know about your eustachian tube. It connects your middle ear to the back of your throat. It equalizes air pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane. Now, when you go up over a mountain, or if you go up in an airplane, your ears will pop. And what you're doing is you're opening up that passageway and allowing the air to go in behind your eardrum. So it's normally closed, but if you swallow or yawn, then that'll open it back up. So people who have trouble with pressure in their ears, when they fly, they'll give them some chewing gum to chew. Or they'll just tell you to yawn or open your mouth as wide as you can. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, it also allows throat infections to go up to the middle ear. So I'm going to tell you a piece of advice, hopefully that you will take it to heart. When you sniff, you're pulling mucus and any infection up into the eustachian tube. So don't sniff. And little kids, because they're so short, their eustachian tubes don't slant very much. They're almost horizontal because the kids are so short. But as they grow taller, the eustachian tube starts slanting downward, which is why you don't have as many ear infections as an adult as you did when you were a child. So teach little kids not to sniff. Teach them to blow, and that's going to help them not have ear infections. The other thing is to check and see what the kid's allergic to and try to stay away from that, because anytime the child eats something they're allergic to, it's going to cause the release of histamines, it's going to cause fluid, and it can swell up the eustachian tube and allow an ear infection to take place. The official name for an ear infection is otitis media. So that has to do with ear, and this has to do with the middle, so behind the tympanic membrane. In little kids, it's short and horizontal. When you're grown up, it actually slants downward. There's a couple of things that they can do when a kid has otitis media. One is to give them an antibiotic. Amoxicillin is usually the antibiotic given. And of course, you can take an antihistamine to dry up some of the fluid in the ear so that the bacteria don't have anything to live in. The other thing that's a little more drastic is to actually take a tiny lance and poke a hole at the base of the eardrum to allow the fluid to run out through the hole rather than tearing the tympanic membrane. Occasionally they'll actually put in tubes. Most of the people I talked to that had tubes put in their kids' ears, it only lasted for a week or two before the tubes fell out. They don't sew them in, they just place them in there. And here's a picture of your eustachian tube, and here's a picture of a kid's eustachian tube. And here's a ruptured or perforated eardrum, right there where it tore. When we did the chapter on the brain and the cranial nerves, we learned about the vestibulocochlear nerve. And here it is coming in, and it's meeting up with the vestibule area right there, and the cochlea, which looks like a snail. This is a slice through the cochlea, and I think it looks so beautiful. It almost looks like lace inside there. The inner ear is protected by the temporal bone. So this is a slice through the temporal bone. You should know that the semicircular canals are the organs of equilibrium, and the cochlea also helps with the equilibrium, but it is the organ of hearing. You may have heard about cochlear implants bringing sound to children who have been deaf. Here's a child who's had a cochlear implant, but you have to be very careful because you actually have to do surgery to attach this through the skull. So the child has to be careful if they're playing sports that they don't knock this off. Here's showing where it's connected through the skull and down into and around the cochlea. There are different models. They work in older people and even little babies. Here's the tympanic membrane. Here are the ossicles, the three bones, hammer, anvil, and stirrup, malleus, incus, stapes, the vestibule, and then here are the three semicircular canals, and you see they're in different orientations. So this is how you can tell whether your head's over to the left or to the right, or you're bending over. Here's where the sound comes in through the pinna, the external auditory meatus, and then here's the hearing apparatus in the temporal bone. Another thing, when you're looking at the vestibulocochlear nerve, it looks like three pieces, and that's because the facial nerve also gets in on the action. So there's your vestibulocochlear nerve and the facial nerve, which is the number 7, which is different from the trigeminal, which is number 5, which is the one that innervates the face also. So that's confusing. The number 5 is the facial trigeminal, and then the facial nerve that's called facial nerve is number 7. But it's more deep. It does things like help out with hearing. It's interesting to look at the cochlea from this orientation, because we usually look at it as a flat surface like a snail, but look how it actually is more like a dome. And while the middle ear is dry, where the bones are and the tympanic membrane, unless of course you've got an infection that came up your eustachian tube, this whole area is full of fluid. If you're going to be an audiologist, you're going to test people's hearing, then you need to learn all of these things. I'm happy if you remember that the cochlea and the semicircular canals are full of fluid. The place where the stapes are attached is called the oval window. So that's where that little thing that looks like a stirrup from a horse is sitting right there. Here's a slice through the cochlea, and you can see that there's a fluid here and a different fluid here. And then this right here has been enlarged over here, so we can actually see where the cochlear nerve comes up, and it has those hairs in that fluid. On top of the hair cells are long, stiff microvilli called stereocilia. And then there's a kind of a gelatinous membrane. Here's an electron micrograph picture. Remember, the electron micrograph pictures are all gray. So you can put them in a computer and you can make them different colors. So there's the inner hair cells and there's the outer hair cells. When I showed you the video of the ossicles vibrating, you saw the tympanic membrane vibrating and it was moving the three little bones. And now you know that the stirrup, or the stapes, is attached to the oval window of the vestibule. So by taking the movement of air and vibrating the tympanic membrane, you are concentrating the mechanical energy through the ossicles over to the oval window, and this is going to cause the fluid that is inside to start vibrating, and it's going to be moving those hairs. You have muscles that can pull the tympanic membrane, the eardrum, to lessen the amount of sound, to lessen the amount of motion. Here's another muscle that reduces the motion of the stapes, which is the stirrup. So all of this will muffle the transfer of vibration to protect your ear. Another interesting thing about the inner ear muscles is they help you coordinate your speech. They also dampen the sound of your own speech. Stop this video, put your fingers in your ear and talk. It sounds so strange to hear yourself talk when you've got your fingers in your ear, because now you can hear yourself speaking, where before you had all kinds of ambient sounds around you as well as yourself speaking. It's always a shock to hear yourself. When I play back my YouTube videos, it always freaks me out because I think, oh my goodness, is that the way I really sound? The outer and the middle ear capture mechanical energy, the motion of air in the outer and the motion of those bones in the middle ear. Now, once you get into the inner ear, we're actually going to get an electrochemical gradient going, and this should be kind of reminiscent of when we went through the nerve chapter, when we went through the muscle chapter, and we have a gradient across a membrane. Anytime you have an electrical gradient across a membrane, you can get an action potential. We've talked about different things that can open up a channel and allow sodium, potassium, and calcium to be able to move through. We've talked about voltage gated. We've talked about ion gated. We had ligand gated, where you have something like a neurotransmitter that touches down and triggers the receptor. And now we're going to talk about a stretch gated or mechanical gated. So the movement of the hairs themselves opens up ion channels, and it generates action potentials in the cochlear nerve. Here's a little cartoon version showing you the hairs upright and the potassium gate is closed. And then when you bend the hairs over, because you're moving the fluid around in there, it's going to open it up. The more sound that's coming in, the louder it appears to be to us. And louder sounds make the membrane vibrate more, and the brain interprets this as a louder sound. Now, one of the things that I think is funny, back in the days before streaming TV and cable TV and all of that stuff, you just had regular TV, and every 15 minutes they would stop, and then they would have a commercial. And everybody would use that time to run to the bathroom or run and grab a snack or something to drink. Well, they realized that people were leaving the room during the commercials, so they started making the commercials really, really loud. Well, for the people who didn't leave the room, all of a sudden they had to turn the volume down because the people were shouting and the music was so loud in the commercials. So they passed a ruling that you couldn't do that anymore. And they set a top level. You can't go louder than this in a commercial. So what the people who make the commercials did, instead of having, as we normally have, where you're talking normally, and then you get really excited and you talk louder, and then you get very excited and you squeal like, oh my gosh, that's wonderful. You have all these different levels of loudness. They just made the entire commercial at the maximum loudness that was allowed by the ruling. So next time you are watching a TV show that still has commercials, listen to the commercial and see. You're welcome to look at this, but I'm not going to ask you about these things. You should know that sound is measured in hertz and decibels. The frequency is so many hertz. The hearing pathway is a little more complicated than some of the other senses that we've been looking at. So you've actually got 4 neurons. So you're going to go from the cochlea to the medulla, and then you're going to go to the pons, then you're going to go to the thalamus, and then finally you're going to get to the primary auditory cortex. You're welcome to memorize all of that, but I'm not going to ask it on a test. But how complicated. Look at that. It's got to go from the cochlea up here, up here, up here, up here, and then finally to the outer part of the cortex of the cerebrum. And now let's spend a few moments talking about deafness, or the inability to hear. So you can have two different kinds. Conductive deafness, so you're not able to conduct vibrations and make it to the inner ear. And some of the things that can cause that would be if you've damaged your eardrum. Kids used to set off firecrackers and blow out their eardrums, and so they were deaf for the rest of their life. Otitis media, remember that is an inner ear infection or middle ear infection. Any blockage of the auditory canal, which could be a fungus, it could be a bacteria, and in some cases you actually get a hardening in some part of the ear. When we talk about arthritis, we talk about the joints, and some of the bone overgrows and fills in the joint. And you look at people who have arthritis, a lot of times they have a swelling, especially in their hands, where the arthritis is. And you can, since these are bones, the auditory ossicles, those hammer, anvil, and stirrup, or malleus, incus, and stapes, they also can get arthritis. They can also fuse. The other kind of hearing loss is with the sensory and the neural. So basically it's nerve deafness. This is pronounced sensorineural. Sensorineural. Try saying that 3 times. This is where those hair cells actually die. So you're damaging the nerves themselves. And where you're going to see this, factory workers who have really, really loud conditions and they don't wear any ear protection, musicians, because we have those huge, astounding amplifiers now that can just blow your eardrums out. They're louder than jets taking off. And then construction workers, when you think of all the things that they do when they drop girders, when they jackhammer, they need to be wearing protection. Even using the nail guns. In some of the universities where I teach, in the lab we take tuning forks and we place them up on the top of the skull, and then we place them near the mastoid process behind the ear, and we listen for bone conduction. And by that you can tell whether the hearing loss that a person has is conductive or whether it is sensorineural. Those 3 semicircular canals detect angular acceleration, and then you have other chambers that are responsible for linear acceleration. And don't forget those little otoliths that are sitting on the hairs and telling you whether you're upright or moving. Now try to imagine you're riding on a really fast carnival ride, and it spins you round and round and round. It's going to stir that fluid, and it's going to move the otoliths. And when you get off the ride, you're going to stumble like you're drunk, because you're getting all sorts of mixed messages as those little otoliths, those little rocks, settle back down on the hairs and send the signal that everything is okay and you're standing upright and not moving. I'm sure you know somebody who is car sick or air sick, and you have the ability to say whether or not you're going up and down like in an elevator or whether you're going around a corner. But I remember back before they had leveled out all the roads, whenever we would travel back roads, they just followed the contours of the land. And so sometimes when we were going along, we would say that we left our stomach at the top of the hill. You go up and then you go down, and you go so fast it literally makes it feel like your stomach is lifting up in your body. But actually you're messing with your ears and the equilibrium system up in your ears. So a lot of times people who are going on curvy roads will end up throwing up. They can't process that information. And again, some people who fly have the same problem. There are some medicines that you can take that will help you with motion sickness, like Dramamine. And you can also take antihistamines to dry up some of the fluid. So here you go, the little otoliths are calcium carbonate and proteins. And here's a picture where they've sliced it open and you can see the hairs and you can see the otoliths. And here's where the kid has their face looking forward and looking down at a book. And there you go. You're bending the hairs. So this message is going, you're looking down. I've always been amazed by figure skaters who can spin and then just glide off. If I spun around like that, either I'd throw up or I'd be so wobbly after that I couldn't get myself together. When we talked about the brain, we talked about the cerebrum being the thinking part of the brain, and we talked about the lobes, the frontal, the occipital, temporal. But we also talked about the cerebellum, the one that has the tree of life, the arbor vitae in it. And we said, well, it is used for balance and coordination. Well, here they are showing you how you get the information from the semicircular canals and the vestibule, and you send it over to the pons, and you can tell the cerebellum what's going on. You can compensate for your eye movements. Think about, what are your eyes doing when you're spinning around? And a lot of people shut their eyes so they don't get any input. So they're not trying to translate all the information coming in through their eyes also. And then you go up and you have parts of the brain that are aware of spatial orientation and movement. And now we get to the eyes. And we're going to talk about the retina, and we're going to talk about color blindness and things of that nature. Night vision, day vision, color vision. The sun sends out electromagnetic energy in a huge spectrum of wavelengths. But of all of those wavelengths, some of them we only perceive as heat. That would be your infrared. And then some of them, the wavelengths are too narrow for us to be able to pick them up with our retina. And so you're going into the ultraviolet. You're also getting into the danger region, because ultraviolet is a high enough frequency that it can cause damage. Trying to explain this to someone, I kind of use the example of when someone's coming through the doorway and one person bumps into you, you're like, oof, somebody just ran into me. But if you have a bunch of people running through the doorway and hitting you, the first one you go, oof, and they hit you, and then the next one hits you, and then the next one hits you. And if you've ever heard about stampedes or anything at a concert, or when somebody yells fire in a movie theater, then people can get trampled because too many people hit them over and over and over. So as you get a higher and higher frequency, when you get to ultraviolet, then you're actually damaging the eyes. And if you go higher than that, you have X-rays, you have gamma radiation, and those also all damage the body because they're such a high frequency. But if you're in the frequency from 400 to 700, then you're in what we call visible light range. And we can actually perceive these as colors. So the longer ones are going to be your red, and then you have orange. And if you know Roy G. Biv, you know the rest of them. red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. So these are violet, and then the ones that are even higher frequency are going to be the ultraviolet, and the ones that are below the red are the infrared. So in order to cause us to see something, it actually has to have a photochemical reaction in our eye. In this day and age of smartphones and iPhones and all of the other things that we have now, you probably have never taken a picture with a camera and had it developed. But back in the day, before we had all these amazing things that we have now, you used to take a picture with a camera and you would go into a dark room. And the dark room would just have red light in it. It would not have any of the other wavelengths of light. Well, they are a low enough energy that they would not develop the photographic film. So you didn't have to worry about ruining your film by opening up your camera in the dark. But yet, because you had the red light on, you have enough vision in your eyes that can detect red light that you could see what was going on in the room. And you could go over and put your film into the chemicals and you could develop it and put it on paper. One of the things that they're suggesting now, if you have trouble when you wake up in the night and you roll over and you look at your clock that you've got beside your bed, if it has a blue light, it's a high enough energy that it could actually wake you up. So they're suggesting that if you're going to have a light in your bedroom, that it be a red light so that it doesn't wake you up. The external parts of the eye that I would like for you to know, of course, would be the iris, which is the colored portion, the pupil, which lays behind the cornea and the lens, and the sclera, or the white of your eye. Some people call it the conjunctiva, and if you get pink eye or if you get an infection in your eye and your eye turns bright red, they call it conjunctivitis. Behind your eyeball, you have a cushion of fat, and people who have thyroid problems, like Graves' disease, you'll actually put extra fat behind your eyes, and your eyeballs will protrude or bug out. It's hard for me when I see someone with their eyes sticking out like that, not to walk up to them and say, "Hey, you need to go have your thyroid checked." I remember a big debate that raged amongst the anatomists about the surface of the eye. So here in this book, it's talking about the lacrimal apparatus, the tear-making apparatus, and it washes and lubricates your eyes so your eyes don't dry out. But it's not just water. There's oils and other minerals and electrolytes and things in there. And then you have a bactericidal lysozyme. So you actually have an enzyme that will digest things that land on your eye that might want to take up occupation and start growing in your eye. So you're constantly getting spores and mold, fungus, worm eggs, bacteria, viruses. You get all sorts of things. One of the questions that they had was, can you catch COVID by someone sneezing and you get it in your eyes? And logic would say yes, because it could go down the tear duct and get into the back of your throat, and it could go down into your lungs that way. So it can manage to make its way there. So the big debate was whether or not there are white blood cells that come across the surface of the eye and remove any pathogens. And to this day, I don't know if they've ever resolved it, but I always thought it was so funny. It's like when you wake up in the morning, a lot of times you have a wad of goo where you had your eyes shut, and so the tears and the stuff that forms in your eye can't travel down through the tear duct, and so it builds up in the corner of your eye. And it's like then why don't you just take some of that and put it on a microscope slide and see if there's any white blood cells? I always thought that was the funniest argument when there's an easy way to answer the question besides just looking it up on the internet, or back then it would be looking it up in a medical text.